Hey, look at that. April went through a portal, and it was intentional this time. That means it's time for a portal episode, and I think most of you figured out what today's subject would be. Well, partly at least. See, I'm not taking a look at the movie version of the Neverending Story. I'm taking a look at the original book by Michael Ende. About the author. Michael Ende was born in Germany in 1929, Bavaria to be specific. The 1930s was a hell of a decade to be a child in Germany, and while he had no Jewish heritage to worry about, his father, Edgar Ende, was a surrealist painter, and his works were banned by the Nazi Party in 1936. Edgar continued to work in secret, and then World War II began, and a few years later, Munich, the city the Endes lived in, went up in flames. Michael Ende was 15 in 1945, old enough to join the war for a desperate Nazi party, but when he got drafted, he tore up the letter and joined a resistance group for the remainder of the war. After the war, Ende had the same artistic inclinations as his father, and his first dream was to become a stage actor. The dream quickly became a disappointment, but his time as a touring actor gave him some real-world experience that he would later consider invaluable. As the 40s became the 50s, Ende started writing for cabarets, and he also found work as a film critic. At the end of the 1950s, Ende wrote his first children's novel, Jim Knopf. It was 500 pages, pretty long for a children's book, and after getting a lot of rejections, he eventually found a place that would publish him as long as he broke it into two halves. In 1960, the first half came out and won the Berlin Literary Prize for youth fiction. The second half reached shelves in 1962, and soon after that, both halves got adapted into radio and TV shows, and translated into multiple languages. Ende's works were mostly aimed at children, but he made a point of tackling some fairly mature issues, the kind of things that adults often don't learn. He also incorporated elements of surrealism and postmodernism, since he grew up surrounded by such things. He understood that the written word is both ink on paper and the visions this ink creates in your mind. And thus the audience, the reader, becomes an equal participant in a work when he or she begins interpreting it. I'm explaining this now because these elements are very much in play in today's novel, The Neverending Story. Michael Ende published The Neverending Story in 1979. The English translation by Ralph Mannheim came out in 1983. Mannheim also translated The Complete Grimm's Tales and Hitler's Mein Kampf, but he was Jewish and translating on commission, so I wouldn't hold that last one against him. Hardcover copies of The Neverending Story are unusual in that they use two ink colors. Instead of black, the story is written in a dark purple red and olive green. It's also separated into 26 chapters, each of which begins with a page-sized illuminated letter starting with A and ending with Z. Each one is illustrated by Roswitha Quadflieg. I can only hope I'm pronouncing that right. The Neverending Story was an unqualified hit when it came out, and it led to the 1984 movie, which was produced in West Germany, but featured an English-speaking cast since they were looking to get those sweet, sweet American dollars. I could get into more depth, but this is about the book, so I'll just say this. Michael Ende hated the movie adaptation, mostly because it was a skin-deep look at the first half of his book and its ending compared to the books. Well, you'll see. Ende sued the studio to get his name off the credits, or at least to change the name of the film, but obviously he lost. But now it's time to explore the differences with The Neverending Story. The book begins with our protagonist, Bastian Balthazar Books, ducking into a bookstore to evade some bullies. He encounters the store's owner, Carl Conrad Coriander, and we get some information about Bastian. He's 10 years old, he's pudgy, he's out of shape, he's unpopular, he's a coward, and he's kinda stupid because he got held back a grade. Oh, and his mother died a couple of years back, and his dad has been neglecting him ever since. Bastian's one redeeming quality is that he's good at coming up with stories and names, and that doesn't amount to much. He also loves books, so when Carl heads into the back to take a phone call, Bastian looks at the book he was reading, The Neverending Story, and he gets an irresistible urge to steal it. He regrets his choice immediately, but he's too much of a coward to return the book, so he sneaks into his school's attic and begins to read. And as Chapter 1 begins, the purple text switches to green. A rockchur, a tiny, a nighthawk, and a will-o'-the-wisp all meet in the woods. They're all on their way to the ivory tower to meet the childlike empress to ask her for help. Each of their lands is being consumed by the nothing, an irresistible force that makes things stop existing. Like, when the nothing consumes a lake, it doesn't leave behind a dry lake bed. It leaves behind nothing. It stops existing and becomes impossible to see. The four creatures eventually reach the ivory tower, but they can't get an audience because every other land in Fantastica has also sent an emissary to ask about the nothing. So instead, they go on their own adventures. But that is another story. It shall be told another time. Meanwhile, it turns out that the childlike empress is sick, a fact that doubtlessly has something to do with the nothing. You see, the empress makes no demands of her subjects, and loves them all equally, good and evil alike, and so she is less the ruler and more the embodiment of Fantastica. And now that she's sick, physicians come from all over but have no idea what to do. But the childlike empress has a plan. She gives the Orin, an amulet and the symbol of her power, to the centaur Chiron and tells him to bring it to her champion, Atreyu of the Greenskin village. Like Bastion, Atreyu is 10 years old, but he is strong, courageous, and clever. Atreyu accepts his mission, so he dons his purple-red cloak to cover his olive-green skin, mounts his white horse Artax, and rides off. Atreyu gets a vision that sends him to the swamps of sadness and Morla, the giant depressed tortoise that lives at its center. The Orin protects Atreyu from the sadness of the swamp, but sadly his horse succumbs and sinks below its surface. For her part, Morla doesn't care if she lives or dies, but since it doesn't matter, she tells Atreyu to seek out Uyulala, the southern oracle. After leaving the swamps, Atreyu comes across Igramol, a giant mass of spider demons, and her prey, a luck dragon named Falcor. Igramol listens to Atreyu since he bears the Orin and all creatures of Fantastica respect it, and she tells him that her poison has the power to transport people anywhere they want to go in an instant. Atreyu lets Igramol bite him, and he teleports to the Southern Oracle, and since Falcor was listening, he goes too. Fortunately, a couple of tiny gnomics are watching the Oracle's gates, so they spot the two and treat their poison. Once Atreyu is well again, the husband gnomic, Engiwuk, describes the 3 gates of the Southern Oracle. The first is a pair of sphinxes, and it seems completely arbitrary which ones they let through and which ones they paralyze with their riddle vision. Second is the Mirror Gate, which shows you your inner soul. Third is the No-Key Gate, which only lets you pass if you don't want to go in. Atreyu passes all 3, but here's the creepy bit. When he looks into the mirror, he sees Bastion reading the Neverending Story in the school attic. Bastion recognizes his own description, but he can hardly believe it. Atreyu meets Uyulala, and she tells him that only a human from the outer world can save the childlike empress by giving her a new name. Bastion thinks to himself that he'd love to help, but he says nothing. Atreyu then decides to try and leave Fantastica to get a human, but he and Falcor get blown off course by the wind giants. Atreyu lands just outside Spook City, just as all the spooks give up hope and cast themselves into the nothing. But there's one person still left in town, the werewolf, Gumork. Gumork comes from outside Fantastica and does the Nothing's bidding in exchange for his existence. And he knows what happens to Fantasticans who fall into the Nothing. They enter the real world and become lies. White lies, ugly lies, pretty lies, convincing lies. It all depends on what they were in Fantastica. They harm the real world with their presence. And so, as the Nothing expands, the real world suffers. Eventually, Falcor recovers the Orin and Atreyu, and they return to the Ivory Tower to report their failure. But the childlike Empress says Atreyu succeeded. He brought a human child with him, one who watched him through all his struggles, and now he has but to say the Empress's new name and Fantastica will be saved. And Bastion wimps out. At first, he still can't believe that they're talking about him, and so Atreyu and the Empress have a very on-point conversation that makes it clear that they mean Bastion. But Bastion continues to wimp out, so the childlike Empress takes matters into her own hands and sets out to find the old man on Wandering Mountain. The old man is the ink to the Empress's empty white page, and the two are never supposed to meet. But desperate times call for desperate measures, and so the Empress orders the old man to start writing the book again from the very beginning. And the very beginning of the Neverending Story starts with Bastion ducking into a bookstore. The whole universe, Bastion included, fall into a time loop until Bastion finally gives in and gives the childlike Empress a new name, Moonchild. And yes, that is what he's shouting into the storm in the movie. Bastion comes to his senses in a black void where nothing exists except him and Moonchild. He's also now a part of the green text instead of the red. Moonchild gives him the orange, turns out to say, "Do what you wish" on the back. She asks Bastion to make a wish, as many wishes as he can, because while Fantastica is now just a grain of sand, it will grow back to its former glory with every wish he makes. So Bastion wishes to be strong, and the grain of sand sprouts into a jungle full of strengthening fruits. However, it also turns out that every wish takes a memory, and when Bastion becomes strong, he also forgets being weak. He then wishes to be handsome, and as he turns into an Arabian prince, he forgets about being a pasty German kid. He then wishes for endurance, and the jungle becomes a desert as the sun rises and he forgets about being a wimp. He wishes for courage in the face of danger, and meets the massive lion who roams the desert, and he forgets about being timid. Bastion stays with the lion Groggerman for some time, the lion who has existed since time began, even though Bastion had only just dreamed him up. Bastion claims a sword, Sikanda, which shines brightly and wields itself, but only if it wishes to. Should the wielder try to pull it out, something bad will happen. Bastion then wishes for fame, so he encounters the Temple of 1,000 Doors and uses it to find Atreyu. Bastion comes across a company of 4 knights and a princess, led by the hero Heinrich. The 4 are on their way to a contest held in the silver city of Amarganth. Atreyu and Falcor are looking for the savior, Bastion, and so they want 3 hardy companions to go with them. Heinrich wants to prove that he's the best in the world to impress Princess Oglamar. The other 3 knights are known for their speed, strength, and endurance, respectively. They invite Bastion to come along without knowing who he is, and ask him to mount their mule. The 3 knights enter the tournament, and when they come out on top, Heinrich takes them all on at once and beats them. So Bastion steps in and easily defeats Heinrich. Atreyu takes a good look at him, and while he didn't recognize Bastion at first, he announces that the search for the savior is now over. Amarganth erupts in a celebration, and it turns out Bastion's original talent is in high demand. Fantasticans are unable to come up with their own stories, and so when Bastion gives the city a backstory, they celebrate all the more. And just like the lion Groggerman, this story has always been true from the moment Bastion tells it. Meanwhile, Heinrich is crestfallen, since Princess Oglamar isn't satisfied with second best. So Bastion invents a terrible dragon to kidnap Oglamar so Heinrich can prove his worth. Eventually, Heinrich defeats the dragon, but by then, he no longer wants to marry her. But that is another story, that shall be told another time. However, Bastion begins to worry about what he's doing. He's creating monsters and describing terrible things. Why would he do that to Fantastica? So, as he, Atreyu, and the 3 knights set out, Bastion resolves to only create happy stories, where only good things happen, so that people will think of him as a good person. He gets his first chance not far from Amarganth. In his backstory for the city, he created a race of hideous creatures that use their alkaline tears to mine silver and turn it into beautiful filigree structures. So when Bastion encounters them, he tells them that they're only larvae, and soon they'll become cocoons and turn into happy butterfly clowns. So that's what happens. Because of this transformation, they destroy their beautiful tower in a fit of childish joy. By this point, Atreyu has noticed that Bastion is losing his memories every time he makes a wish, and he urges him to stop. Bastion does so, but then they start walking in circles, because Fantastica doesn't lead anywhere unless you wish to go somewhere. Incidentally, while Atreyu thinks that Bastion should find a way back to his world, Bastion wants to stay in Fantastica, and so he's leading them to the ivory tower at its center. Bastion starts resenting Atreyu's interference, so he wishes to be respected and feared, even by Atreyu. At the same time, the group is growing, since Fantasticans from all over have come to petition Bastion to give them a story. So the makeshift caravan is attacked by giant empty suits of armor, sent by the evil sorceress, Zaid. Bastion defeats Zaid's forces single-handedly with his sword Secanda, at which point Zaid surrenders immediately and offers to support Bastion in the future. She then goes to her waiting litter at the caravan, and Atreyu gets suspicious. It's never said directly, but Zaid's power is to control anything that's empty inside, and so she starts encouraging Bastion to ignore his friends and seek the throne of the ivory tower. The childlike empress is gone. The blank white pages can only exist before the story begins, and so it is Bastion's right to crown himself the Emperor of Fantastica, and become completely empty in the process. Bastion and Atreyu have a falling out along the way, and as Bastion's coronation approaches, Atreyu gathers an army of rebels to fight him. The day of the coronation erupts into battle, but when Bastion tries to wield Secanda against his friend, the blade turns completely black. Atreyu is wounded and falls, but Bastion is horrified by what he's done and runs away from the burning ruins of the ivory tower. Bastion eventually ends up in the city of the Old Emperors. It's full of humans who unwisely spent their wishes, leaving none left for the journey home. Or else they crowned themselves emperor or empress and lost all their wishes the moment they took the throne. The caretaker of the city, Arjax, tells Bastion all this, and he warns Bastion that he only has 3 or 4 wishes left, barely enough to get back to reality. Bastion starts to make different kinds of wishes after this. He wishes to be an accepted part of a community, and so he meets the collective Yiskalnari, who let him join their town, and he forgets about humanity. Bastion then wishes for love, unconditional motherly love, and so he finds Dame Iola in the House of Change, who has always wanted a child to love. He then forgets about his parents. Finally, he makes his last wish, his one completely unselfish wish, and it's to help someone whom he has now forgotten. So he finds his way to the picture mine, and Yor, the blind miner, and he mines the strata of dreams that make up the bedrock of Fantastica until he finds his own dream. A picture of his father, lonely and isolated, the person that Bastion desperately wishes to help. Bastion then forgets his name. Atreyu shows up then, and on seeing him, the boy with no name removes the Orin and sets it on the ground. This transforms it into a gateway to the Water of Life, the portal that will take Bastion back home. Unfortunately, Bastion's poor choices catch up with him now. He can't leave Fantastica until he completes every story he started. Fortunately, Atreyu pledges to finish them for him, and so Bastion returns to reality. It's the morning after he read the book. Bastion now has all his memories from reality and all his memories from Fantastica, making him a lot more mature than he was the day before. He goes straight home to his father, who's worried sick since his son disappeared the day before. They both promise to start over as a family, and then Bastion heads to Coriander's shop to admit that he stole the Neverending Story, and that the book disappeared when he awoke. Coriander turns out to understand everything Bastion tells him. He too has been to Fantastica multiple times, and each time he gave the childlike empress a new name and experienced a new story. Every real story is a never-ending story, he says, and there are many doors to Fantastica. The two propose to trade stories the next time they see each other, and the book ends. The analysis. Okay, I am not going to do this book justice. It's a children's novel written by a postmodernist who has experience with critical theory, satire, and surrealism. This book has so many layers, I could analyze my own analysis. So let me just cover a couple of the obvious takes. The first half of this novel is a child's guide to existentialism. Bastian represents the reader, but he's not the reader, and in fact, he's a character within the book. However, Atreyu represents Bastian. Atreyu isn't Bastian, and Atreyu is a character within Bastian's book. Except that Bastian's book begins with the first words of the book in your hands, you, the reader. The Old Man of Wandering Mountain proves that when he starts the book over again halfway through it. Let me see if I can explain this better. Have you ever heard of the painting, The Treachery of Images? It's a surrealist painting, and it's pretty simple. There's an image of a smoking pipe and a caption, "Ceci n'est pas une pipe." This is not a pipe. The first thing you think is, well, that's absurd, that's clearly a pipe. But then you think about it, and you realize the caption is right. That's not a pipe. That is a representation of a pipe, a two-dimensional picture. You can't pick it up, you can't feel the smooth wooden handle, and you can't pack tobacco into the bowl. For that matter, the caption also applies to itself. The word pipe isn't a pipe either, even though it's supposed to remind you of one. This is what the Neverending Story is getting at. Atreyu doesn't exist, and yet he does exist in your mind while you read his story. The red and green text takes shape and becomes the protagonist, a green boy with a red cape. It is real in that it reminds you of reality, even though it is only ink on paper. That is why the audience is an active participant in every story. A story is nothing without a reader. The second half of the book is a child's guide to causality. It's also an allegory for writing. The moment Bastian enters the story, he becomes its author. The childlike empress is the empty pages of a future manuscript, and the story begins when Bastian gives her a name, a title. As soon as he does, and as soon as he has an idea of what he wants to create, the void fills up with a jungle that has always been there. That's how it works when you write fiction, even if it's realistic. The characters you create and the world they live in have always existed, even though you, the author, have only just now come up with their names. Things go well at first, even though Bastian's protagonist is an obvious self-insert who has all the powers he wishes belong to him. He goes around solving problems only he can solve, and he helps people who deserves to get help. And he creates side stories about more interesting characters that involve real stakes and honest tragedy. He gathers a fandom who love all the things he creates, especially when it's about them. But then Bastian realizes that he's writing about terrible, awful things. He's putting his characters through hell. Who would do that? Who would like him for writing about terrible things? So instead, he writes non-stories with no stakes and no conflicts, where his self-insert just fixes everything, no problem. He's the best. Don't you all agree? But he does this because he's forgetting about his own past, about the conflicts in his own life that defined him and gave him a basis to write about struggle. His form is improving, but he's lost his heart, and he's letting the ego trip of a fan base get to his head. So naturally, just when he's about to crown himself the best writer ever, he gets torn down from the throne by the very people who originally supported him. So it's time to do some soul searching. He sees all the other failed authors who never amounted to anything and rejects that ending. Instead, he joins a community of like-minded people. He realizes that all that surface-level fame is nothing compared to the value of truly being loved. And he realizes at the very end that the one thing he truly wanted to do was reach somebody, to say something valuable that just might change a person's life for the better. And when he realizes that, he obtains the water of life. With it, he can write the healing lies of fiction that reveal and dissolve the harmful lies of reality. One last thing. If you buy the Neverending Story, make sure you buy a hardcover copy, or a digital version with the original colored text and illustrations. Paperback copies and some digital versions use italics instead of colors, and you really can't get the complete experience without them. Thanks for joining me again for today's book review, and I hope I'll see you next time for a 50s Heinlein book that isn't fascist, but does get uncomfortably close. But that is another story, and shall be told another time.